Hey guys, welcome back to the Diet Doc Life Mastery Podcast. I'm Joe Klemczewski with Dr. Kori Propst. We're going to talk for 2 episodes. We got the whole thing mapped out. Strategy is laid down to the foundation on binge eating. And we're doing this in that way because Kori and I just start talking and some of these series can become endless. So we're just like line in the sand.
Yep, here we go. Yeah.
And this is Kori's wheelhouse, binge eating. But Kori, I made the suggestion that we simplify this by talking about the physiology of binge eating and the psychology, because this is just kind of a never-ending topic with those of us in the physique sport world. We have clients. I work with a lot of coaches around the world now, and all of those coaches have just hundreds and thousands of clients. And so we see more and more of these things come to the surface, and I think it's just imperative that we give enough good information to help people understand how normal some components are,
yes,
how abnormal some are, and that this is something that you need to address. You can't just think, oh, well, this just is part of it. It's just not.
No, I completely agree. And I think as coaches, we have a responsibility to almost put this out there up front. Like, you are going to experience certain things during this prep that can push you in some not so healthy directions. And so let's address those up front and work through them together. Yeah.
And I have always claimed that the starting point for binge eating is physiological. It's just that gut starvation mode, and you become an animal. I've experienced this when I was competing. I have never binged in my life. I'm not a big eater until I'm 5-6% body fat, carbs are low, cardio's high, and I have gotten into cycles where I just become somebody else. And I've been even embarrassed, like looking at my wife across the kitchen, watching me eat, and she just wants to leave the room. Because some people do it in a closet, I guess, but I mean, when you become that ravenous and you just start shoving food down your throat and you don't even care what you're eating, I know there are people watching who could probably tell far worse stories, but it's just painfully shaming, counterproductive to all of your goals and your health. And you know that, and you still can't stop.
Well, Joe, food restriction and deprivation is the number one risk factor for binge eating. What's interesting is that, and this surprises a lot of people when I explain it this way, is that it's binge eating, even though it's so much food. And it's not just individuals who are competing and who are at 5 or 6% body fat who struggle with this. I have lots of clients who live in larger bodies who aren't 5 or 6% body fat, who may be 30-40% body fat, who still are engaged in binge or emotional eating. But when you look at what's happening under the surface, there's still restrictive behaviors going on. Just because someone is in a larger body and may have more fat doesn't mean that there's not restriction or deprivation happening, because they've typically been dieting very rigidly. And so, yes, it starts with restriction and a sense of starvation and not getting enough. I do have clients too, though, who it's not, I'm going to shove whatever in my face. It becomes a planned behavior also, where they go and get the foods that they sense being most attractive to them, but then they do end up just eating a copious amount of it, and they're not necessarily tasting it. And to your point, it ends up at the end of the binge with them feeling incredibly ashamed and just out of control.
Yeah. And you and I have done so many podcasts on this. Anybody watching this, please seek out some of our longer form sessions on this. But Kori, just to stay in the physiology side, are there ways to intervene? Like I would say, when I was engaging in this, I started making some safeguards to stop that. Like I would say, okay, these are, trigger foods. This is what kind of gets me hungry, or so I'm going to avoid those. I'm going to stick to more whole food, something maybe, lower on the glycemic index. And I would, I kind of create this phrase, stay ahead of hunger sometimes, when you're that restricted and depleted because of, something that's performance related. And so it wasn't necessarily all by choice or felt choice.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would, just stick to a schedule. But are there things that you give structurally that can be helpful physiologically?
Well, this is where the waters get a little murky because you're saying, like, I identified what my trigger foods were, and so I stayed away from those. And that right there, Joe, can create another sense of deprivation.
Yeah,
like
I'm
now
adding
we're
restriction
exactly
onto my restriction.
Yes, and the mind doesn't know the difference between actual food restriction, like not eating, and psychological restriction, saying I can't have that, or I need to keep that away, or I shouldn't be buying these things, or tomorrow will be better, I just won't eat that much again. Like in the body and mind, those are the exact same. So,
well, one thing too, I'm sorry to cut you off there for a second, but I want to make sure that I give a poignant answer to some people who are going to have this question, which is you can only lose a certain amount of body fat at a time. That's humanly possible. And if you are struggling with binge eating, physiologically, you probably are just consuming too little food. And so you have to adjust your time scale, your expectations on what you can lose. You have to reduce training. There are a lot of reasons why you're binging. And as Kori said, the first and primary reason is restriction. You're probably just restricting too far.
So in terms of structure, it's number one is to eat adequately. And that can be viewed or perceived in a lot of different ways, because if you're pursuing physique competition, it's your structure, and eating adequately is going to look a lot different than for a person who has just been chronic dieting their entire lives and wants to move towards a different relationship with food in their bodies, right? But on the physiology side, again, I think it's really important for people to understand that their bodies aren't betraying them. Okay, yes, that's psychology. Like, remember, your body is not betraying you. That's the story you're telling in your head because you've just engaged in a behavior that begins to feel shameful, and you start blaming yourself and wondering what's wrong with you and why you don't have any self-control. But your body is trying to protect you. Okay, so our brains evolved not for us to be happy and joyful all the time, but to live, to survive. So when we are in that severe of food restriction, again, it doesn't matter whether you're thinking restrictively or just not eating, and your body perceives a famine, it's going to do what it can to prompt eating and feeding. So it's not your fault. There's no one to blame and nothing to blame. It's a natural reaction to restriction.
And Kori, this let's stop on this point because here is an interesting little point of serendipity. I said we should do this particular series because Adam Atkinson and I have talked about this. You and he have in Contest Prep University, but you are planning, and I think you may have just released an actual kind of a focus group, an interactive group on binge eating. Tell me about that.
Yeah, it's going to be a 3-month transformational experience called Binge Eating Breakthrough Take Back Control. It starts November 1st. People can register through October 31st. And we're going to have a very concentrated focus group, a weekly focus group that everyone is involved in. And then we're going to have a private Facebook discussion and support group. And then monthly, I'm going to do private phone calls or video chats with every participant. So the main thing with this, Joe, is I work with a lot of people who come to me with binge eating or emotional eating, and I'm working with them one-on-one. And that's highly effective, except what I hear from a lot of them is that they just don't have the group support that they need. They need to know that other people are working on this too. Because one-on-one, there's they're working with me and we're engaged, and then, you know, they're practicing outside of sessions, but outside of our work together, they're inundated with the social media all the time about who's doing this diet. And I started Whole30, and I'm doing the keto diet, and I just lost 15 pounds last week. And so it's just, they're getting such mixed messages. So we're coming together and we're banding together and doing this in a much more generative way. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, Kori, thanks for that. And that's going to be a good transition point. We'll stop here, guys. And on our next episode, we're going to switch over to the psychology of binge eating. So thank you guys for watching and listening, and we will see you next time in the Diet Doc Life Mastery Podcast.
Thanks, guys.